Most people think selling a parent's home is a estate decision. It's not. It's a situation decision, and that's why so many families make costly mistakes before they even list the house. Most agents sort of jump straight to the execution side of things, such as pricing, listings, marketing, those kinds of things. But in these situations, there's actually a process that has to happen before any of that can be done. We call it a four-step process or a home transition framework. And that's first, we start with authority. And inside authority, we think that anybody can sell the property, or we try to go ahead and move the property forward without really understanding authority. There are some differences between authority and ownership, and they can all sort of play a role when it comes to being able to sell a parent's house. And so the first thing that we have to do is actually establish authority, because if we don't, or we don't understand the authority, we could end up getting all the way through the entire process, have a listing contract to be close to closing, and finally realize that all of that's invalid because we didn't actually have the proper authority to sell. And so just to give you an idea, like in probate, this might be letters, of testamentary, and appointing the personal representative inside of personal representative for the estate. We have other examples, like for trusts, it could simply be, the trustee. And for different stuff, conservatorships, guardianships, those kinds of things. Or we could just simply have power of attorney. So now this isn't a legal basis to determine, because sometimes there are even different situations where perhaps things or these authority documents are actually nullified by different stuff, and that's something that you'll have to sit with an attorney with. The second process is that we call is stabilization, and this is all about sort of reducing the risk for the property. Now, unless you're pretty much set on selling the property to a cash investor within 2 weeks, the reality is that you got to figure out how to stabilize the property. Sometimes there's risks to the property that could be like decreasing or quietly eroding the value of the property. Decreasing value, think about like a roof leak. As the roof is leaking, water's getting in, we're going to slowly deteriorate the property, because you have to think about whatever process you're a part of. Even if you have authority today to sell a parent's house, you have to look at the time on market and the time on close. Even if you list something today, by the time it takes to close, it's still going to be, you're looking at 30, 60 days, those kinds of things. So what is the timeline that we're kind of looking at, and what risks are actually present inside of the property? But then there's also sort of these like decreasing cash or increasing pressure side of things. And I think about those as like mortgage. If there's a mortgage on the property, property taxes, these are all sort of costs to hold the property. And so we want to figure out these numbers and try to minimize them as much as possible. I think that's where people sometimes explore different options, like can we put a renter inside of it, or can somebody in the family live in it part time, and that sort of a stuff. And the whole objective, especially, is to like, we want to create space to slow this decision down, so that we do not, because we do not want to sort of sell with increased pressure, because we're going to make decisions that we wouldn't otherwise. And I think we're going to end up lowering the valuation or the ultimate sale price of the property. The third thing that we look at is alignment. And this is probably one of the most important things, because the question is like, what are we trying to achieve, and what are our realities to selling the property or to holding the property? So we'll just say, what are our realities of the property? Again, this kind of goes back to the stabilization in terms of what the property cost. And then the first thing is, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to maximize the sale price? Are we trying to decrease the cost of the property? Are we trying to pay for care? Do we want to hold on to this property to preserve legacy or part of the family inheritance. And so we have to align those sorts of things. There was a situation one time that I ran into where a family they had called a real estate agent. They had assumed that they needed to sell the property because they were planning, or they were basically trying to do Medicaid spend down, and they didn't really understand, and their real estate agent had no context of primary residence exemptions for Medicaid. And so they ended up selling the property. The real estate agent didn't slow down enough. That's the part of the problem when you start with execution. And then they ended up selling the property, and they were holding a bunch of cash, and there's no real exemption as far as, when, not in the way that real estate is, for cash. And so therefore all of that was involved in the Medicaid spend down, and actually had to be spent for care before they could even qualify for Medicaid. And so, which that leads us to the last one, which is simply the execution. This is where we start to decide to, price, prepare, and sell the home. Here in the execution phase, this is where sometimes too many people start with trying to clear out the property, make any necessary repairs to the property, and those sorts of things. And maybe you'll want to do some of those things regardless of what decision you make with the property, but certainly we don't want to start here. And that's why we say that this is one of the most misunderstood kind of processes and frameworks. And that's why we say families need to use this